Today we're going to be diving into everything you need to know about modulation. We're going to be starting off a little bit more basic and then progressing to some more advanced stuff a little bit later on. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what exactly is modulation? Modulation is the act of changing a parameter over time with a modulator. Modulators usually come in the form of LFOs or envelopes. And we can see this clearly when we look at something like wavetable, right? If you go to the mod sources tab, you can see our modulation sources or modulators. We have 3 envelopes and then we have 2 LFOs. Up the top here, the matrix is where we assign these modulators to the parameters along the side. So if we click on something, it'll show up as a parameter here. And then we can simply start modulating these parameters by assigning them to one of these modulation sources. In Serum, our modulation sources are located all along this panel here though. We have 3 envelopes and 4 LFOs. We can also use velocity and note information as modulators as well. By the way, if you want some nice free Serum presets, go check out the link I've left in the description. So this is how modulation works within a synth, but modulation extends throughout our whole track as well. We can literally modulate any single parameter that we want. So if I was to go up here and type in LFO, I could grab an LFO and drag it onto my track, hit the map button, assign it to a parameter, and you can see it's changing over time. So this is the basics of modulation and how it works. We're essentially using it to change things in our project to make our tracks sound more interesting. Using the simpler device is probably the best way to start using modulation in practice and understand what things sound good to modulate. So I've got this pad here, right? If I just drag it in, it's going to make it simpler automatically. That sounds good. Let's make some notes. So if I go over to the controls panel, this is the modulation section. So you can see the LFO here, and you can change the rate of that LFO with this slider here. And then we have 4 destinations that we can modulate. These 4 destinations are really common and useful and can make your sounds a lot more interesting. So let's have a listen to this. And when I start assigning some volume automation, you can already hear it starting to take effect. So if I make that really extreme, and you can change the rate over here again. If I assign some pitch as well. Maybe some panning. Maybe even some filter. A lot more interesting already, but to step it up one step further, what I might even do is go grab an LFO like we did earlier and drag it on here. And if I just hit the map button and map it to my filter frequency as well over here, now we're modulating the filter twice with 2 different modulators. So this is going to start to create some really interesting rhythms. First things first, I'm going to assign the range. So 60 to 80%, something like this. I'm going to change the rate to 2 bars because our MIDI clip is 2 bars long. And let's have a listen to this effect. So already with a bit of modulation, it makes the sound so much more interesting. This is the before. Just really sort of stale and flat, and now it has a lot more dimension to it, right? And something like this is a really good starting point for building your track around. So I've gone ahead and created some bass and drums just to show you what that would look like. So we've touched on volume modulation, pitch, pan, and filter modulation. These are probably our most common types and very, very useful. We've also touched on double modulation, so modulating one parameter with 2 different LFOs. And now let's move on to perhaps my favorite, which is effects modulation. So first of all, I want to make the distinction between modulation effects and effects modulation. So modulation effects are these guys in here. We've got phasers, flanges, choruses, tremolo devices, anything that has a LFO built into it. You can see that when I drag on this chorus, you can see the actual LFOs in here. A chorus has 2 different audio streams or more. It uses pitch modulation and panning to create some wide chorusing effects. But if we go over give it a vibrato, we can see that this is actually one audio stream just being pitched up and down. This is just pitch modulation, like what we touched on in the simpler device. And if we grab a tremolo device, this is just volume automation like we were doing earlier as well. So these are modulation effects, effects that have LFOs built into the algorithms of the effects themselves, whereas effects modulation is when we use modulation to modulate any effect that we want. Effects modulation is really easy to do on things like return tracks. So I've just made a new return track here. And if I go grab a reverb device and just drag it on here, I'm going to put it to 100% wet and maybe turn the decay time up a little bit and then send this piano sound into it. So you can hear that reverb in there. But what about something like this? What about some pitch modulation, aka vibrato, behind the reverb device? So the actual piano sound itself isn't being pitch modulated, but the reverb, just the reverb, is being wobbled around. So let's have a listen to this. So you can hear the actual hit of the piano still sounds clean, but the reverb itself is waving and modulating around. That's a pretty cool effect. One of my favorites is using filter modulation. So I'm going to grab my auto filter, drag it in here, and then I can actually just modulate this filter to move around. And you can hear that awesome filtered reverb sound in the background. So now the reverb is moving around in a really cool way. We can actually just use this LFO that's built into this auto filter, and that's just going to do exactly this, move the filter up and down like I was just doing then. One of my absolute favorite processing effects to use is this rack here, which is just exactly this. It's an echo and a reverb in parallel, right? And before each of these effects, we have this filter that is being modulated by this LFO like we were just talking about. Each of these filters is moving around at a different rate, and it creates this really lush sound here. So let's turn it off first. This is the dry, and then with it on. You'll notice that most effects actually have LFOs built into them. This one has a modulation tab. Over here, we actually have a modulation section. And this makes it so you don't actually have to go get a third-party LFO. They already have them built in. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't experiment. I would still highly, highly recommend going over to this modulators tab and just grabbing one of these modulators, dragging it onto something like a return track is really fun because you're actually modulating the processing rather than just the original signal, so it's a little bit safer in this way. Let's see what happens when I modulate this redux over here. I'm going to go over to a different wave, maybe a down, something like this, and just link the rate and set it a little bit slower. And let's have a look at this, because we're just modulating, we're just changing what the delay device or the echo device is going to sound like. Let me bring this up a little bit. So now this redux is being modulated and it's giving this echo a really nice character. So this is where I open the floor to you. Go open up an Ableton project and spend 10 minutes or so trying to modulate things. See if you can come up with something that you think sounds cool that you'd like to modulate when it comes to making a track. If you have a nice modulation technique that you found, leave a comment in the description below and I'd love to try it out myself. There's really so much endless possibility to all of this, so I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video today, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next one.